You weren't authorized to touch that patient. The supervisor snapped as the nurse's hands still trembled from CPR. Wasn't even on your shift. But she was the only one who acted. The next morning, a high-ranking officer entered the ICU carrying a folded American flag and a question that brought the entire hospital to silence. Ever seen someone punished for doing the right thing? Type 1 if you have. It began as an ordinary Tuesday morning at St. Mary's Hospital. Clara Reynolds, a 30-year-old nurse with 6 years of experience, is known for her meticulous adherence to protocol but also for her unwavering belief that patients always came before paperwork. Clara noticed the slight tremble in his hands as orderlies wheeled in the new transfer patty and Leonard Garrison, 78, wore a faded veteran's cap that had seen better days. A small oxygen tube ran beneath his nose and his weathered face carried deep lines of a life fully lived. The medical chart indicated been transferred for specialized cardiac care. After a series of concerning episodes, Clara passed by, clipboard in hand, reviewing another patient's medication schedule. She heard its distinctive alarm, a heart monitor flatlining. She turned to see Leonard's body go rigid. The orderlies froze, uncertain. In that moment, no doctors were present in the hallway. Without hesitation, Clara dropped her clipboard. The sound of plastic hitting linoleum echoed through the suddenly silent corridor. She rushed to Leonard's side, lowering the stretcher guardrail. Code blue, she shouted, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. A crash car. Their hands found their position on Leonard's chest, interlaced fingers, arms straight, shoulders aligned. She began compressions with mechanical precision. 123 for she counted silently, maintaining the rhythm that might keep this stranger alive. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she reached 90 seconds. Her arms burned. Still no response. Come on, she whispered. Fight. After nearly 2 minutes, which felt like an eternity, Leonard's chest suddenly heaved on its own. A weak but definite pulse reader. Clara stepped back, her scrubs damp with perspiration, her arms trembling from exertion. That's when Supervisor Margaret Walters appeared, face contorted with bureaucratic fury. She didn't ask about the patient's condition, didn't acknowledge the life, just Saburo authorized you to intervene, she demanded, voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. This patient isn't assigned to your ward. You violated protocol. Clara stood speechless, still catching her breath as Margaret confiscated hurried badge. You were suspended pending review. Clear at your locker. Clara looked once more at Leonardo, breathing steadily. As the emergency response team finally arrived, she nodded slightly, then walked away, her footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent hallway. Stories like this exist because of people like you. Stay with us and help spread what's right. Clara sat alone in the staff break room, staring at her reflection in the coffee she hadn't touched. The suspension notice lay beside her, effective immediately. The hospital administration had called an emergency review meeting and are the Carjan authorized medical intervention duty her assigned responsibility. The glass walls. She could see her colleagues casting sympathetic glance, but most averted their eyes. Hospital politics. Nobody wanted to be next. Their phone buzzed, a text from Nurse Jenkins. You did the right thing, but they're scared of liability. Don't expect support from management. Clara slipped her phone back into her pocket. 6 years of spotless performance reviews, countless lives touched, and no work career hung in the balance because she had refused to watch a man die. The meeting room felt unnecessarily cold when Clara entered. 5 faces looked up: Director of Nursing, Hospital Administratorial Council representative, and of course a supervisor. Walters. No, at least Miss Reynolds. The administrator began shuffling papers impotently. You understand why we're here. Your actions this morning represent a serious breach of hospital protocol. I performed CPR on a patient in cardiac arrest. Clara replied, her voice quiet but unwavering. There were no doctors present. The transport of were not trained in advanced life support. That wasn't your determination to make. Walters interjected. He wasn't your assigned patient. There's a chain of command. If I had waited for proper authorization. Clear interrupt, admitting the supervisor's gaze directly. Mr. Garrison would be dead right now. As that the outcome you would have preferred. The room fell silent. From the corner of her eye, Clara noticed a man in a dark suit rise from his seat in the waiting area outside. He had been listening intently, walked away quickly, phone already at his This isn't about preference, as the legal counsel spoke carefully. It's about liability and established protocols when staff act beyond their assigned scope. My scope is saving lives. Clara said, that's what I was trained to do. That's what I swore to do. Administrator sighed. Well, reconvene after reviewing the security footage. Until then your suspension stands. What no one in that room realized was that the man who had been listening, the one who had slipped away to make a phone call, was retired Colonel James Garrison, Leonard's younger brother, and he had heard everything. In a quiet corner of the hospital lobby, James spoke urgently into his phone. General, it's Garrison, need a favor. His voice dropped lower. Samin deserves protection and recognition. How quickly can you get here? Back in her locker room, Clara slowly packed her personal items, a framed photo of her graduation, a coffee mug gifted by a patient's family, small tokens of a career she had poured her heart into. Tosh wondered how many lives would be lost to protocol and bureaucracy, how many split-second decisions would be scrutinized by people who had never had to make them. She didn't regret what she'd done. She would do it again, even if it cost her everything. At precisely 11:00 the distinctive sound of polished dress shoes on linoleum turned heads through the hospital's administrative wing. A tall figure in full military dress uniform moved with purpose through the quarters. Colonel Michael Harris, decorated combat veteran and current military liaison officer, carried a wooden box tucked under one arm and an official envelope bearing government seals in his hand. The medals on his chest caught the fluorescent light, each one representing moments of valor that few civilians could comprehend. He need to speak with your hospital director, he informed the startled receptionist, his voice calm but brooking no argument. Immediately the receptionist fumbled with the phone, eyes wide at the imposing figure before her. Sir, may I ask what this is regarding? It concerns a matter of a North, Colonel replied, standing perfectly straight, this cap tucked precisely under his arm, and a nurse named Clara Reynolds. Within minutes Clara found herself summoned back to the same meeting room. This time, however, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. The hospital director herself had joined them, her usually confident demeanor noticeably subdued, and at the head of the table sat Colonel Harris's expression unreadable. Decades of military discipline withered fast, revealing nothing but the gravitas of his purpose. I understand, the colonel began, his voice carrying the weight of authority that needed no volume to command attention, that Nurse Reynolds has been suspended for providing life-saving care to Leonard Garrison. The director shifted uncomfortably in her leather care manicured fingers, adjusting papers that didn't need arranging. Colonel, with all due respect, this is an internal hospital matter. Leonard Garrison, the colonel continued as if she hadn't spoken, each word measured and deliberate, is not just any patient. He opened the wooden box with reverent care, revealing a purple heart medal nestled against deep blue velvet. Metal gleamed under the conference room lights, its purple and gold a stark contrast to the sterile whites and blues of the hospital environment. Staff Sergeant Leonard Garrison served 3 tours in Vietnam. During his second tour, cared for wounded men through enemy fire after their helicopter was shot down with shrapnel in his leg and burns across his back. Returned to the wreckage 3 times, refusing evacuation until every man was accounted for. 2 of those men are now surgeons. Soon as a congressman the room fell silent. Even Supervisor Walters appeared to shrink in her chair, her previous radiusness evaded like morning mist. Colonel Harris slid a USB drive across the table. Eve took and the liberty of reviewing your security footage. It clearly shows that Nurse Reynolds was the only medical professional who responded appropriately to a life-threatening situation. She followed every protocol for emergency intervention excellently, as she should have. The director inserted the drive into her laptop. The room watched in silence as the morning's events unfolded on screen. Clara's immediate responsive perfect form of her CPR technique, with precious minutes that passed before anyone else arrived to help in the military. Colonel Harris continued to have a saying, initiative in the absence of orders. It means taking the right action when there's no time to wait for permission. It's what we train our best for. Turn to Clara, your actions embody the highest standards of medical care and human decency. You didn't need to know Sergeant Garrison's military record to know his life was worth saving. Hospital director cleared her throat in light of this additional context. I believe we should reconsider our position. Miss Reynolds' suspension is lifted immediately. It's not enough, Colonel Harris said firmly. This woman deserves recognition and apology. She exemplifies everything your hospital should stand for. Director nodded slowly. You're right, and we will address our emergency response protocols to ensure this situation doesn't repeat itself. Supervisor Walter stared at her folded hands. Suitable to meet anyone's ace. Sometimes, Colonel Harrison said, rising to his feet, bravest thing isn't running into combat enemies, it's standing up to The Piaplujo should be on your side. He extended his hand to Clara on behalf of the armed forces and the garrison family. Thank you. As Clara shook his hand, she noticed something she hadn't before. The colonel wore a medical service pin on his uniform. He had once been one of them. You don't owe me an apology, Colonel Harris told the hospital staff as he prepared to leave. You owe her your gratitude. Some people don't need authority, just the instinct to save lives. Subscribe to never miss stories about those who dare to do what's right. 3 days later, Clara stood beside Leonard Garrison's bed in the ICU. His eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on her face. Recognition dawned in his weathered features. You were the one, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Me brother told me what happened at Clara. Adjusted his IV line. Just doing my job, Mr. Garrison. Leonard's hand, spotted with age but still strong, reached for hers. I pulled men from burning helicopters, she said, carried buddies through jungles when they couldn't walk. Never once thought, his eyes glistened, and never thought someone would save me someday. Clara squeezed his hand gently. That's how it works. We look out for each other. Later that afternoon, Clara found Supervisor Walters waiting by the nurse's station. The older woman's usual rigid posture had softened, her eyes downcast. Nurse Reynolds, she began, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. You owe you an apology, a public one. She gestured toward the staff gathering for shift change. May I? Clara nodded, uncertain what to expect. Walters cleared her throat, drawing the attention of the dozen nurses preparing for the evening shift. I want to acknowledge something important, she announced. 3 days ago, Nurse Reynolds made a decision that saved a life. He responded by punishing her for it. Their voice wavered slightly. Was wrong, and I am sorry. To Clara's astonishment, head nurse continued, from today forward we're implementing a new emergency response protocol. Clara code read, authorizing any qualified nurse to initiate emergency procedure when a doctor isn't immediately available. Owned by one. The nurses rose to their feet. Applause started slowly, then built until it filled the room. Clara felt her cheeks flush with unexpected emotion. Dr. Morris, the hospital's chief of medicine, appeared in the doorway. Nurse Reynolds, she called out above the applause. If director would like to see you in the director's office. Clara was surprised to find both Colonel Harris and James Garrison waiting alongside hospital leadership. We've been reviewing our emergency response protocols, the director explained, and we've realized they're inadequate. Focused on hierarchy, not enough on patient outcomes. Handed Clara a folder. Would like you to head a committee to revise them. With your experience and moral clarity, you're the right person to lead this change. As Clara left the office, her reinstated ID badge clipped securely to her scrub, she paused to look through the ICU window. Leonard sat propped up in bed, his brother James beside him, with men laughing at some shared memory. Thought about the fine line between rules and purpose, about how systems designed to protect can sometimes do the opposite, and about the courage it takes to distinguish between them. When Clara entered the ICU for her evening rounds, the usual bustle of activity briefly paused, but this time the eyes that turned toward her held something new, not scrutiny or judgment, but respect. She nodded briefly, then turned to her patients. After all, they were why she was here. Some things hadn't changed. There are people trained to save lives, but not everyone has the courage to act when no one gives permission. Clara didn't wait. Because of thought, a life was preserved, a policy was rewritten, and a community learned what truly matters in a world often paralyzed by protocols and permissions. It's easy to forget why those systems were created in the first place. They exist to save lives, not to prevent heroes from emerging. The hospital's new Clark Code Red protocol wasn't just about changing rule, as it was about remembering the human heartbeat behind every regulation. Lead Garrison spent decades believing he was the one who saved others. It took Clara Reynolds to show him that courage flows in all directions, that sometimes the battlefield is a hospital corridor, and sometimes the enemy isn't foreign, it's our own fear of stepping outside the lines. Perhaps the most profound victory wasn't the one Clara won against hospital bureaucrats, it was the victory she won for every patient who would come after, those whose lives would now be saved because someone dared to rewrite death rules of permission. When lives hung in the balance, most heroic acts aren't performed on battlefields but in hospital corridors. Amenities The bravest decisions aren't the ones that follow the rules, but the ones that remember why the rules exist in the first place. Have you ever witnessed someone criticized for doing what was right? Share your story below. Subscribe to Ironheart Stories, where righteous actions are always told and honored the way they deserve.